On today's episode of Angel's Garage, the Thunderbird gets its front end put back together. So, if you're curious to see what it looks like to throw some springs, shocks, hubs, spindles, control arms, and brakes back into one of these cars, then you're in luck as we continue the restoration of this 1963 Thunderbird. Let's go!
Nearly a year after I had removed the front steering and suspension system to strip and paint my car, I was now ready to begin the process of reinstalling all those parts back onto my freshly painted Thunderbird. And since my car was freshly painted and these parts were very much not painted, that would be where I started today's adventure. The most effective way to remove the years of dirt, grime, and rust from all these parts would be to media blast them. Using some fine grit, black diamond coal slag, the media blaster wasted no time taking these parts down to bare steel, leaving a nice rough surface for the primer. One piece I had to be careful blasting though was the spindle. The ends of the spindles have a machined surface that the hubs ride on, which need to be left perfectly smooth. To achieve that, I used some aluminum foil tape to cover up the ends of the hubs, which would protect the smooth machined surface from any blasting media that could potentially damage it. All of these clean and abraded parts were hung up and then 2 coats of epoxy primer were sprayed on. I actually had to do several different spraying sessions because between all the control arms, springs, struts, drum brakes, and other miscellaneous suspension components, needless to say, I had a lot to paint. With a good corrosion-resistant barrier on all these parts now, I left them to dry for 24 hours, then sprayed them all down with black single stage. The parts were looking fantastic now, meaning we were officially ready to start throwing them all back onto the body of the car. The lower control arms would be the first parts to go on. Normally before installing the control arms, the first step would be to install new ball joints and bushings. But I had a local shop that had experience working on these old Fords take care of removing and replacing all these parts for me. Not that I couldn't replace the ball joints and bushings myself, but the shop gave a good price, and the thought of pressing out old corroded ball joints and bushings didn't sound fun, so I figured, why not? So with those out of the way, I started out by reinstalling the pivot bracket back onto the lower control arm. I slid the bracket over the new bushing, then once aligned, I pushed the pivot bolt through the bracket and bushing and tightened the nut and bolt down. I then torqued the pivot nut to specifications and fitted the control arm back into the car, only to see that it really didn't pivot or move at all. It just sprung back into position. I knew the arm needed to move during installation, so I checked the book again and found this statement: tighten the nut snug. Do not torque until lower arm assembly is installed in the car. Oh, what a great way to start. One step in and I'm already making mistakes. So I pulled the control arm off, backed the nut off and snugged it as instructed by the book, and then reinstalled the arm back into the car, with it actually being able to pivot this time. With that embarrassment behind me, and reading the steps in the book much more carefully now, I pressed on. Going inside the engine bay, I installed the washers onto the back of the pivot bracket, oiled the threads up to make installing the nuts easier, then threaded on and snugged down the bracket retaining nut and the shim plate nut. Speaking of the shim plate nut, the shim plates go between the frame and the pivot bracket. These shims are used to adjust the camber on the car, or essentially the tilt of the wheels when viewed from the front of the car. The original shims were stuck down on both of my pivot brackets, so I decided just to paint over them and keep them as is for now. I'm sure they'll have to be adjusted later when I take the car in for alignment, but that's a problem for future me to figure out.
Wait, what?
Anyways, I repeated all these steps on the driver's side, finishing off the lower control arm installation for now. Moving straight into the upper control arms, the shop had also replaced the ball joints and shaft bushings on these guys too. The bushings had grease fittings on them, so my first order of business was to go ahead and grease them up while they were still easy to access. After greasing all the bushings and taking a good look at the control arms, I noticed a discrepancy between the shafts. One of the shafts was centered up pretty good, while the other one was definitely more off-center. Referring back to the book, there's actually a dimension given on how to center the shafts on the upper control arm. So all I had to do was set the center of one of the holes 1.85 inches away from the inside edge of the control arm. How hard could it be?
Oh boy.
Well, quite hard actually if you just filled up the entire bushing with grease, which made it almost impossible to rotate the shafts. I had to take the grease fitting off to relieve the pressure, which allowed me to finally adjust the shaft. I wiped off all the excess grease and checked the dimensions with a dial caliper, and once I was satisfied, I put the grease fitting back on and resurfaced the bushings with more grease. I double checked the shaft on the other control arm, and after determining it was good, I was ready to install them on the car. I slid the control arm onto the studs located in the wheel well. Then after tapping the control arm further down onto the studs using a rubber mallet, I threw on the washers and lock nuts, then tightened the nuts down and torqued them. The next components to go back in would be the struts, or as I like to call them, the hockey sticks. The fronts of the struts get mounted to the frame of the car first, which involves sliding on a bushing cup, then the first half of the bushing, which also has a steel sleeve inside of it, then the second half of the bushing, then the other bushing cup, then finally, the nut which holds it all together. The frame gets sandwiched between the bushings, sitting inside the depressed section here. After assembling this stack up of bushings and cups on the car, I snugged the strut down using a ratchet, which, while I'm glad Ford gave enough room to get a ratchet inside the little box the strut sits in, they didn't give a lot of room to turn the ratchet. So after several 1/8 turns, the front of the strut was secured down for now. Next up was connecting the rear of the strut to the lower control arm using the retaining nuts and bolts. These bolts are used to adjust the caster of the wheels, or the tilt they sit at when viewed from the side of the car. The bolts were not wanting to slide into the lower control arm at all, no matter how hard I tried. I soon discovered that the bracket that sat under the control arm, which also sat under the ball joint, was slightly misaligned. All this required was loosening up the ball joint retaining bolts and then realigning the bracket. With the bracket aligned now, the strut bolts slid right in. I threaded the nuts on and then tightened them down, trying to adjust the strut to the approximate position it was in before.
Now this next part of the video is going to be a cautionary tale on why you should never always trust your shop manual. Because yes, even your shop manual can have mistakes in it too. Now usually, common sense can help you out in these situations. And if I had some more, probably would have helped me out too.
Since I had loosened the bolts holding down the ball joint, I needed to tighten them back up. Looking at the manual, the torque range given for these bolts was 60 to 80 foot-pounds. Now these bolts are not very big, so I should have realized right then and there that something was wrong. But on the other hand, the manual was clearly giving me a specific torque range for these bolts. So what did I do? I set the torque wrench to 60 foot-pounds and tried my best to tighten down those dang bolts. After several turns and questions as to if this was right or not, I felt something break. Taking the nut and bolt apart, I found that something did indeed break. The lock washer had failed and wasn't really looking much like a lock washer anymore. After this, I took everything apart, inspected all my parts to ensure nothing else was broken, and purchased some new hardware to install the ball joint. Upon doing some research online, it was revealed that, yes, the shop manual was wrong. And furthermore, these bolts don't require much torque at all. A more correct number would be 10 to 20 foot-pounds, depending on the grade of nut and bolt. So, with this new information, I tightened the new bolts down to the correct torque, and the ball joint was finally installed for good this time. The next piece of this steering and suspension puzzle to go back together would be the spindle. The spindle is connected to the control arms via the ball joints, which have tapered studs the spindle slides over. To make sure the tapered fittings on the spindle fit perfectly on the ball joints, I removed all the paint from the inside of the holes using a small wire wheel. After getting the inside of these holes clean, I removed the nuts from the ball joints, shoved the spindle onto the bottom ball joint, slid the top ball joint through the spindle, and then reinstalled the nuts. I tightened the nuts down using a ratchet, then began the long, slow process of torquing them down. After torquing the nuts to the bottom value of the torque range, I checked to see if the holes in the studs and the castle nuts were aligned, and lucky for me, they were. Grabbing the cotter pins, I slid a pin into the bottom and top ball joint and then bent the cotter pin over the stud to lock it into place. With the spindle now secured into place, I serviced the ball joints with some fresh grease, being careful to try and not overfill them. Too much grease and the rubber ball joint boots could potentially tear, which would be less than ideal. Going back to the strut, it was time to torque it down. Starting with the nut up front, I torqued it to the lowest value specified in the manual and found that, in this case, the castle nut did not line up with the hole in the strut. This is why I always torque castle nuts to the lowest value, because in order to align it, I need to tighten the nut until it aligns. This normally isn't too hard, but with torque values so high now and almost no weight on the car, I just about torqued the whole car off the jack stands. After that little scare, I finished tightening the nut, albeit a little more carefully now. Then I installed the cotter pin. I then torqued the two bolts at the other end of the strut, completing the strut installation. I then repeated this all on the driver's side, starting with replacing the lower ball joint hardware, tightening down the strut bolts, installing the spindle, tightening down the spindle nuts, torquing the nuts, installing the cotter pins, greasing up the ball joints, torquing the nut on the front of the strut, being careful to not torque the car off the jack stands, installing the cotter pin on the nut, and finally, torquing down the two bolts on the back of the strut. It was time now to unite the two lower control arms together with the sway bar. After I had painted the sway bar, the fun task of sliding on the new bushings began. There really is no easy way to do this. You just have to fight the bushings the whole way until they are in the correct position. Shoving the bushings over the circular ends of the sway bar was definitely the worst part of this whole ordeal, just because of how tight of a fit it was. Once I was past that, All I had to do was shimmy the bushings down the shaft. With the bushings in place now, I pressed the brackets over the bushings, then the sway bar was good to go. Installing the sway bar was a simple matter of bolting the brackets to the bottom of the frame. One thing I did notice though was that it was possible to put the sway bar in upside down. As y'all can see, during my first installation attempt, the bar was raised up a bit. I didn't think this looked right, and after confirming this was wrong, I flipped the bar around and got it installed in the correct orientation. Using a new set of bushings and hardware, I connected the sway bar to the control arms. I assembled a stack up of cups, bushings, and spacers on the bolt going between the sway bar and the control arm. Then I attempted to install the nut. The driver's side wasn't too bad, which I got torqued down in a jiffy. The passenger side though was not fun. I couldn't get the bolt to protrude enough from the bottom for me to thread the nut on, and after several failed attempts to start the nut, I grabbed the jack and raised the control arms up quite a bit. This finally allowed me to get the nut started, then I got the passenger side torqued down as well. The front end was looking rather complete now, but it was missing one rather large and crucial component, a spring that is so big that its removal and installation is described as one of the most dangerous jobs on the car. But before that, a little prep work needs to be done first. First up is installing the large steel plates the top of the spring rests on. These plates sit below the shock tower and are held in place with two pressed in studs that are used to hold down the shock plate. That is assuming the studs are still pressed in and doing their job like on the driver's side. The passenger side, not so much. The studs fell out during disassembly and the plate came out along with them. No big deal, all I had to do was weld the studs back to the plate, then life was good. But of course, I managed to lose the studs. So after finding suitable screws to replace the studs, I welded the screws to the plate. I then gave the plate and my new studs a fresh coat of paint and installed the plate and studs back into the car. The last job before installing the springs was attaching the insulators to the springs. These rubber pieces eliminate metal on metal contact between the spring and the car, preventing squeaking whenever the spring compresses. Using some electrical tape, I taped the top and bottom insulators to the spring, which will hold the insulators in place during installation.
The last bit of prep work was finding the right spring compressors to put these springs back in. It's no secret that the spring compressors I used to take them out was a little less than adequate. But this time, I'll actually be using the correct spring compressor because A, as many of y'all pointed out in the comments, what I did was extremely dangerous, and B, that ain't fitting back into the car. So, after some research, I found these, the OTC 7045B coil spring compressors. Now these are by no means cheap. Oh crap! But if you're looking to do this job yourself, this is definitely the right tool for it.
Assembling the tool and the spring, I first set the bottom plate in the spring. Slide in the threaded rod, install the top plate, then the plate retainer, a roller bearing, and finally, the compressor nut. I kept the plates about 2 coils away from the ends of the spring so that I could easily slide them out later after the spring is installed. Using an impact gun, I start compressing the spring. The impact gun gets a good head start, but once the nut runs down far enough, I had to switch to some good old-fashioned wrenches to finish the job. Following a lot of wrenching, I had the spring compressed down quite a bit. Me and my dad attempted to install the spring, only to find it had to be compressed even more to fit. So after a lot more wrench turning, we had this. This is as compressed gets. And if at any moment the spring compressor decided to fail, it would be like holding a hand grenade. With that in mind, we quickly worked on getting this spring into the car, and with a little persuasion from the pry bar, it was resting in place in no time. The spring compressor was then slowly backed off with the wrench, and the spring stretched back into position. After removing the compressor, the car now officially had one of its springs back in place. And me and my dad didn't have any broken bones, so all in all, definitely a success. All of this work was repeated on the second spring, which went in just as easily. It was at this point that I finally torqued down the lower control arm. I probably could have done this before the spring installation, but the way I interpreted it in the shop manual, it expects the spring to already be installed when you torque the arm down, so I figured I wouldn't take any chances. Having concluded the spring installation with no damage to myself or to the car, I happily moved on to the last piece of the front suspension system, the shocks. I got some brand new, heavy-duty shocks from the bird's nest, but I needed to borrow a few parts off my old shocks, namely the bottom mounting brackets. I removed the nut and bolt holding the brackets on, then pried them off. I then painted the brackets and attempted to install them on the new shocks, only to find it wasn't possible. I fought the shock, trying to slide it inside the bracket, thinking it was just a tight fit, but I soon came to the conclusion that the metal sleeve inside the bushing was just too wide. So, going back to the old shocks, I found that the metal sleeves in them were still in usable shape. So, I pressed the sleeves out using an arbor press. I then pressed the sleeves out of my new shocks and pressed in my old sleeves. It became more obvious once I got the sleeves out why they didn't fit. There was no chance these were going inside the brackets. I touched up the paint on the bracket I had mangled up and then installed the shocks onto the brackets, with much more success this time. A new nut and bolt was installed and tightened down. Then the shocks were ready for the car. I carefully fed the shock through the shock tower and down through the spring. Then once I got the bracket seated in position, I threaded the nuts on and tightened them down. The top of the shocks required a little more assembly. I slid on the first half of the bushing, placed the shock tower plate back on, slid on the upper half of the bushing, and then threaded on the nut. I then finished things off by threading on the nuts for the plate and tightening them down. I will tighten down the top of the shock later when I have some more weight on the suspension system. I repeated all these steps on the driver's side, which finished off my front suspension system. This was by far the most labor-intensive part of the front end rebuild, which means the rest of the jobs should be a cakewalk. Let's say we work on getting this car ready for some new wheels. Mounting the wheels requires at least two jobs first: reinstalling the wheel hubs and reinstalling the brakes, both of which needed some work before going back on. Disassembly would start by pulling the outside wheel bearings off and then pulling the drums and hubs off the brakes. Then, using my handy dandy drum brake tools from Harbor Freight, I tore apart the brakes. First popping all the springs off, then removing the brake shoe adjuster, pulling the hold downs off the brake shoes, removing the brake shoes, and finally, unbolting and removing my old wheel cylinders. The hubs were up next. I planned on replacing the wheel bearings and races, which would involve removing the dust seal on the back, pulling the inside wheel bearing out, and then hammering the old races out. Going from behind the race, I slowly worked the race out with a hammer and punch, which eventually freed it from the hub. With everything taken apart, I painted my hubs, backing plates, and drums, and then set about rebuilding all my pieces. The backing plate is the first piece to get mounted back on the spindle. After sliding the backing plate on and pushing all the studs through, I tightened down all the nuts and torqued them down. The hubs were up next, but before they could go on, they needed their new bearings. I thoroughly cleaned out the inside of the hubs with some solvent wipes. Then starting on the inside bearings, I immediately found that the bearings I got were the wrong size.
Yay.
Well, I guess I'll just start with the outside bearings. These ones were the right size, thankfully, so I hammered the races into place using a bearing driver set. The first one went in pretty easy because the hub was a little worn out, so I double checked to make sure the race was secure and couldn't spin around. The other hub was definitely replaced at some point because it was in great shape, which meant the other race was much harder to hammer in. After several swings, I had the other race seated down too. One trip to Napa later, I exchanged the inside wheel bearings for the correct sized ones. I hammered the inside races in, and after making sure the races were fully seated down, I was ready to pack some grease in these bearings. Giving myself a handful of grease, I began working the grease inside the bearings. After packing the inside bearings with plenty of grease, I put the bearings inside the hubs. I then placed on the new dust seals and hammered them into place. Flipping the hubs over, I packed the inside of the hubs with plenty of grease and then packed the outside bearings with grease. I slid the outside bearings in, and with everything greased up, these hubs were ready to go on the spindles. Grabbing one of the hubs, I carefully slid it over the spindle, making sure I seated the dust seal on the stepped up portion of the spindle. Then I pushed the washer on and threaded on the adjusting nut. Now Ford gives a very specific way to adjust this nut, so here it is. First, while rotating the hub, seat the nut down to 15 to 20 foot-pounds to seat the bearings. Second, slide a nut lock over the adjusting nut until it is aligned with the cotter pin hole. Third, using a 1 1/8 box wrench, loosen both the nut lock and adjusting nut until the next cancellation on the nut lock lines up with the hole. Alternatively, what I did was mark the nut lock and the adjusting nut with a Sharpie, pull the nut lock off, then backed off the adjusting nut. Finally, once the nut is backed off one cancellation, install the cotter pin and bend it around the cancellated flange. The last part of this job is to bead on the dust cap. Then, this job is done. The hub felt great afterwards, so I repeated all these steps on the driver's side, finishing off the hubs. Or so I thought. You see, it was at this point that I was going to install the new wheel cylinders. And looking at where the cylinder mounts to, there is not a lot of space between the spindle and the backing plate. That didn't stop me from trying though. I started the hard to reach bolt in the cylinder, slid the cylinder on the backing plate, and then installed and tightened down the second bolt. I then tried to reach the first bolt, but the wrench was barely grabbing it. Not to mention, when I did grab it, I could hardly turn the wrench. I even tried going at it from the other side, which involved removing the brake bleeding port, but even then I just didn't have enough room to turn the wrench. Good job, Ford. You made a component that should be easy to replace impossible. That is, of course, unless you take the wheel hub off, loosen up the backing plate, then you'll have enough room to tighten up the screw. When looking at the manual, it mentions nothing about pulling the backing plate or hub off to replace this cylinder. It just says pull it off. So, I'm not sure if Ford had a special wrench for this application or some other secret method, but in any event, I finally got my wheel cylinder installed properly. With that debacle sorted out, my last job would be installing the brakes. Armed with new brake hardware and my drum brake tools, I was feeling pretty confident that this last job would be easy. And for the most part, it was. First, the push pins were given a light coat of grease and then pushed into the wheel cylinder. Next, I put a light coat of grease over all the flat spots on the backing plate that the brake shoes will ride against. And now we were ready for brake shoes. The brake shoes do look similar, however, one brake shoe has less pad material on it than the other. This one goes towards the front of the car, while the shoe with more brake pad material goes towards the rear. Holding the first brake shoe up, I slide the retaining pin through the backing plate and the brake shoe, then slide on the hold down spring. Then using the retaining spring tool, I pushed on and twisted the retainer, locking the spring down into place. I repeated this for the second hold down spring, securing the rear brake shoe to the backing plate. Before putting on the forward brake shoe, I took the brake adjusting screw apart, putting some grease on the threads and under the socket. I put the adjusting screw back together, then while holding it and the front brake shoe together, I installed the front brake shoe into the car. The anchor plate went in next, followed by the cable and the cable guide. And now came the fun part of the job, the springs. Each brake shoe has a spring that goes between it and the anchor pin, and in theory, it's easy to replace. Just install one end of the spring on the brake shoe, put the other end on the brake tool, then pry it over the anchor pin. Easy peasy, right? No, not really. While the tool does make it easier, it by no means makes it an easy job. These springs are strong, and getting them over the anchor pin took quite a lot of muscle and patience. But eventually, I pulled the first set of springs over. The adjusting lever went on afterwards. I routed the cable around the cable guide and hooked the top of the cable to the lever. I then hooked the bottom spring to the front brake shoe, and using my tool, I hooked the other end to the adjusting lever. This is by far the easiest spring to install. The last parts to go on would be the remaining brake springs on top. Just like the other top springs, they were a pain, although I seem to struggle with these ones slightly less. With the brake assembly together, I began turning the adjusting screw with a pry bar to spread the brake shoes out, and then slid on the drum and began spinning it around. I kept adjusting the shoes until I felt the shoes slightly and evenly dragging on the drum. I try to get both sides to have the same amount of drag. That way when I begin driving the car and hit the brakes, it will brake both wheels evenly and hopefully not veer me off into a ditch. After the adjustments were complete, the final component to go on would be the dust cover, which is a small rubber plug that gets pushed into the back of the backing plate, sealing the inside of these drum brakes off from any dirt or debris. And that's it for today's episode. On the next episode of the Thunderbird series, I rebuild my steering gearbox and put my steering components back into the car, giving my car all 4 wheels again.
Thank you all so much for watching. Hope you all enjoyed the video, and I'll see you all next time. Bye.